Hey everybody, in this quick video I'm going to be sharing with you what I believe to be the top 4 things you're going to need to know if you really want to make sure that you overcome anxiety and depression in 2023. If you don't know who I am, my name's Hicks. I used to have suicidal depression in my teens, was hospitalized, medicated, put in therapy, and didn't really find that those routes were the best thing, but I knew that there was a way to overcome this because I had seen other people who would improve their mental health. And so my entire life's journey has been figuring out how can people really live without anxiety and depression in their daily life. There's a lot of people who are dealing with it, and I don't want you to be one of them. So there are really a couple key things that you have to learn if you're at the very beginning of your journey and your real goal is to not just be coping with this, but you really want to sustainably figure out a way to get this out of your daily life. These are the kind of first things I was thinking that I would want to tell myself back in time, in that moment when you're feeling totally hopeless and you're not sure what to do. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do is you need to assess what we call your emotional center of gravity. What I've learned over the years working with people on this issue is that we all have an emotional center of gravity. Think of it like a spectrum. So on one side, you've got totally elated, joyful, fulfilled, ecstatic, right? On the other side, you've got like maybe totally hopeless, something in that area. And then in the middle, you've got everything from kind of content to stressed out to angry, right? Things like that. So what you're probably realizing, if you look back at maybe the last 6 months of your life, 3 to 6 months of your life, there have been maybe 2 or 3 core emotions that you've been feeling most of the time. And so even like, let's take, for instance, anxiety is a big one a lot of our listeners are dealing with. So if you're feeling consistently worried and anxious and stressed, then that means that even when something good happens, you might feel, good or happy or content for a short period of time, but then you quickly go down to feeling stressed maybe later that day or the next day or whatever. It's almost like your mind gravitates back to finding something to be worried about. Same thing with feeling sad or depressed, right? You might have some good news, but then you'll sink back down to that emotional center of gravity. And the challenge with this is that even when your life circumstances are going how you want to, our nervous system has that sort of equilibrium that it goes to, and that is conditioned. So if you can wrap your head around the idea that what you're feeling on an ongoing basis is movable. In other words, the emotional center of gravity you're on, like on that total spectrum, let's say you're, over here, you can move that center of gravity so that way, when even bad things happen, you might be stressed for a moment, but then you quickly rebound to feeling happy and light. You might even notice that certain people in your life are like that. It's like no matter what, they're confident or excited or whatever the case is, even when things go badly. That's the thing that we want to make the goal for you. If you think about your anxiety and depression not as a permanent thing that you have to deal with for your whole life, but rather what I've learned is that it's a conditioned there's many things that are conditioned, but it's a conditioned set of thoughts and feelings that cause you to hang out in that one particular zone. And that is what we can shift. That's the real goal. So that's the first big thing I would want you to understand. The second thing, if you really want to make sure that you overcome depression and anxiety, is to recognize that you don't feel anxious or depressed or whatever your negative state is all of the time. You only feel it when certain components are in place. So let me give you an example. Like, let's just presume that your issue right now is you're dealing with really anxious feelings, and you've been dealing with that for maybe several months or several years. So if you look back maybe on the last 12 months, there were probably at least a couple, maybe like a half a dozen even moments. I don't know what amount it is for you, right? But there have probably been a couple of moments where you weren't worried at all. You were feeling maybe more content, maybe more joyful, maybe more just happy, right? Whatever it was. So even if you just think back in the past year, like a moment in time when you were not feeling anxious or worried, think about what that might have been. For a lot of people, it's a moment that they shared with their kids or with their spouse or on vacation, something of that nature. And so it's all well and good to kind of look at that moment and say, oh, well, yeah, Ty, that's just like, a little outlier moment. But the thing to understand is you might have been feeling totally content for, a minute, 5 minutes, a couple hours, a day, right? And then you went back to feeling anxious and stressed. Now, when people see that, they interpret that as, oh, see, I have anxiety. I have this kind of permanent part of who I am that's going to be with me forever. I would say it's a very different thing. What's happening there is there were certain components, there were certain parts of your mindset that were different in those moments when you were not feeling anxious than in the next moment when you did start feeling anxious. And that may not sound like rocket science to you. You might be going, well, yeah, I was not worried in one moment and then I was worried the next moment. But what I want you to start to realize is that any emotional state is available to you at any time. It's just that your nervous system gets conditioned to stay in one predominant emotional state most of the time. Because if it were really true that you were just destined to be an anxious person, right, indefinitely, then I don't think you would be able to really access those moments where you're feeling, happy or elated. And what I've learned, the very first thing I do with my clients, for example, I do a 90-minute session with them, and I have them remember a time when they felt really, really anxious or depressed or whatever their emotional state is. And then I bring them into a joyful state within about 90 seconds. And I show them that there are three main things that you have to trigger to change your emotional state. So in these moments when you felt really good, it's not that that was random. It's not that, that was just an outlier. It's that there were certain ingredients in your mindset that you aren't even aware of right now that were tweaked differently. That's why you felt different. Because what I'm able to do with people very reliably is once I get them on the phone or whatever the case is, I can guide them into feeling those particular desirable states. And I'm going to teach some of them to you here on this video. So number one, figure out what your emotional center of gravity is and view your issue as shifting your emotional center of gravity. Number two, recognize that you can only feel anxious and depressed because of certain patterns of thought, right? When you're not engaging in those certain patterns of thought, you cannot feel anxious or stressed. So I'll give you a very common example. If you're feeling anxious and worried, the chances are that you are spending the majority of your time focusing on the future. And not just the future, but you're probably focusing on what you don't want to have happen in the future. Now, that is one particular form of focus. That's one particular thought pattern out of dozens that you could choose from. So for example, you could be focusing instead on what is enjoyable in this present moment right now, even if there's only one or two things that are enjoyable in the present moment. You could be thinking about what are you grateful for that happened in the past, okay? So there are about 12 different core patterns of focus that our mind can go down, like different rabbit holes, if you like it. Or I like to imagine you're in like a hallway with lots and lots of doors. There are like 12 main doors you can go down, patterns of thought. But what most people do is they get conditioned to open the same door over and over. They just go into, well, what could happen in the future? Well, what could happen in the future? What could happen in the future? And because you keep going down that rabbit hole, you feel anxious every time you go down that rabbit hole. In those moments in the past year or so when you felt elated or content or happy, you were going down a different door. You were thinking about something completely different. So you want to start to realize that your emotions are not happening to you. Your emotions are a byproduct of what you're doing with your brain, right? And you might be doing it unconsciously. You might not be aware that you're doing it, but you are doing it. Kind of like if you drive a car and you zone out and you forget that you're driving and then you end up at the destination, you're like, oh gosh, how did I get here? That's what most people are doing with their head. They don't realize how they're thinking, what they're thinking, why they're thinking that way. They just go, oh my gosh, I feel horrible. And they don't know how they got there. And it feels like it's something that happened to you as opposed to something that you were doing. You were doing it unconsciously, but something that you were doing with your thoughts. Okay. So the third thing that you want to understand out of all this is that your brain is trainable. Your brain is trainable. I'll give you a simple example. First of all, I can give you kind of my own personal example, right? Because I was suicidal back in the day. And, quite honestly, I mean, I've had stressful days. I've had days where I felt overwhelmed, since then. but I truly, legitimately have not felt depressed, right, since that time. That was over 16 years ago. So that's just one anecdotal example, but it'll be easier for me to kind of use an example with your own life here too. So this will be kind of silly, but think about, for instance, something in your life before that you used to think a lot about. So like you might have had a hobby that you did a long time ago, years ago, and you thought about it all the time and you desired to do it all the time and you spent a lot of energy on it and you focused on it a lot. Or if you can't relate to that example, another example might be like a TV show that you were really obsessed with for a while and you thought about it a lot and then you kept wanting to watch it and you kept watching it and it was on your mind even when you weren't watching it, that type of thing. And when you look back on that though, you can remember that it was so predominant in your thoughts. It was so predominant in your focus. You were what we call associated to it, as in you focused on it and you felt things like how good it would feel to go and do that hobby or how good it would feel, to watch that show, right? But now you probably haven't thought about it in maybe many months or years even, right? You maybe can't even relate to that impulse. You can't even, you don't feel anything in regards to it. Another simple example would be someone that you used to have a crush on or someone you thought you were in love with before, but then you guys broke up and now you haven't thought about them in a long, long time, right? So, well, what's different? You might think, okay, well, Ty, what am I supposed to learn from that? Well, the point being that at that time in the past, your mind was going down a specific rabbit hole over and over and over again. Like, you were getting reassociated to that particular thing and you felt those feelings. You felt like how good it would feel to go and do that hobby or how, what it would be like to be in this imaginary world of the TV show, or, you were thinking about what kind of future you'd have with this person you thought you were in love with. You were so associated to it because your mind was focused on it. But what happened is your mind started to focus on other things. Right? Maybe the show ended, or maybe there was a breakup, or maybe you like moved or whatever it was. And now you stopped thinking about that so much. For a while you did. Maybe you missed it, or you were excited for the next season, or, you were heartbroken for a while. Your mind kept going back to it. But then eventually your mind started to drift. Your emotional center of gravity shifted, right? Your thoughts went into a different place. And as they went into a different place, that old item got deleted from your focus, right? It's no longer been a thing that you've been conscious of until I just brought your attention to it just now. So this is how our brain works. Our brain is constantly getting trained of what matters, what is important, what do we focus on, what rabbit holes do we go down, and that determines how we feel, and how we feel regularly determines how we act. So your brain is very trainable. That very often we're experiencing change automatically without directing it, right? What I just shared with you would be an example of how your thoughts and your emotions changed without you maybe choosing to make the change. Progress is where you decide, wait a minute, I keep focusing on this and I'm going to now focus over here. I'm going to figure out how to train the brain to go in this direction so that way you can feel differently and behave differently. And it's doable. You just have a certain set of skills that you have to learn. Okay, so that's the third key, is that your brain is trainable. And then the fourth one is there are two main things that you have to train, okay? So I'm gonna break these down in kind of simple terms just to kind of get you started with it, because it gets more advanced, but I just wanna make sure you have enough that you can start to use. So there's like a 4A and a 4B here, right? So 4A, the first thing that you have to train is the patterns of focus. And I've already been explaining this for a while here, right? So there's all sorts of common ones. You'll feel anxious whenever you focus on the future that you're afraid of. You'll feel grateful whenever you focus on the present and what you can appreciate about the present moment. You'll feel confident when you focus on a future that you want to have happen and you stay focused on that rather than going to what are you afraid will happen. You will feel love when you focus on what you adore or appreciate about other people. You will feel joy consistently when you focus on how you can contribute to other people. That will be one of the ways that you can access joy. So there's this whole advanced thing that I'm not going to go into right this second that we call the emotional map of the mind, which is that there are certain reliable emotions you will feel depending on these. There are three main levers that we, kind of fix in the brain. Today, I'm going to share the top two because these are the big ones that impact you. But combining those three, I think of it as almost like a kaleidoscope. If you've ever looked at like a kaleidoscope, you know how there's like the spinning things at the end where, one thing turns one way, one thing turns the other way, and it creates the different shapes and the different colors. Well, if you have those three things twisted in a particular direction, you're going to get a specific emotional state. So if I'm always focusing on the future and how it could go badly in the future, especially if in my head I'm making like an image of how it could go badly, or something of that nature, it's going to feel very intense and I'm going to feel very anxious. If I think about something from the past that I enjoyed, I'll feel a sense of gratitude and joy. Okay, that's just a simple example. So that's the first big thing, is what you are focused on. Think about what you're focused on as what you're searching for. That's another good way to look at it. Very often people enter into a room and what they're searching for is, what is everybody thinking about me? Or what they're searching for is, how long do I have to be here? Or some people are searching for, who would I like to connect with in this room? That's why some people feel anxious in social situations and some people feel excited in social situations. It has a lot to do with what you're scanning for, what you're focused on. So it's the first big thing that we can help you train, or you can train yourself, right, is how your mind is focused. Because what you're searching for, the mind will find, even if it's not actually seeing what it is that, believes it's seeing. Like if you believe that other people have an unfavorable opinion of you and you're constantly looking for what their unfavorable opinion is of you, your mind is going to start telling you stuff that's not actually true. It's just because that's kind of the mechanics of how the brain works. Okay, so that's the first big thing. The second thing you can change is your internal language and narration inside of the mind, okay? And I'm sure I'm not the first person I've talked to you about with self-talk, but most people totally miss the boat on what actually has to happen in order to change that particular narration. It's not just about the words that you say, it's about the tone that you use, the speed that you say those words in. Each one of those little micro levers changes how you feel. So very often people who are feeling anxious, for example, they're speaking to themselves in a very high-paced voice, very high-pitched, and with a sense of urgency, like, what am I going to do? When am I going to do this, and that's kind of the internal narration. What you will notice is if you slow that down, if you change the tone, if you change the volume, if you bring the volume down, the speed down, 9 times out of 10, that's going to reduce your feelings of anxiety, and you can train the brain to do that so the dialogue is not going constantly like that. The other big thing I'll share with you today, this one topic is really there's a lot more to share on this topic, but just to get you started, is changing the qualities of the internal dialogue. That's what we call the submodalities. And then the other thing that you can do as well is figure out what specific word or phrase choices induce your undesirable emotion. So I'll give you the common ones. The most common anxiety-inducing thoughts are usually something like, I have to XYZ, I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do this. The other common one is what if this happens, what if this happens, what if that happens. Those are probably the two biggest offenders. Some of the most common depression-inducing ones is the question why. That's a big anxiety-inducing one too, is like, why is this happening? Why did this happen? Right? That'll either make you feel anxious or depressed depending on your particular nervous system. And then another depression-inducing one is like, why can't I? Like, why can't I figure this out? Why can't they be nice to me? Why can't my life just go how I want it to go, right? That will induce a feeling of hopelessness. So by cutting off those thoughts and saying, okay, wait, every time I use those thoughts makes me feel like shit. And now you say, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to trade that word choice for something else. Then you can start to improve how you feel dramatically. So that'll kind of get you started. To summarize, number one, you have an emotional center of gravity that can be changed. Number two, you only feel anxious or depressed because certain patterns of the mind, certain patterns of thought are in place at that particular time. So if you figure out what those patterns are, you can change them. Number three, Your brain is trainable, right? And you can start to learn how to train it. And then number 4, the top 2 things you need to learn how to train are, number 1, what your mind is searching for on a consistent basis, and then number 2, the meaning you're giving things through your language, right? And if you start to tweak those 2 things, then you will change how you feel. So I hope this has been helpful to you. We've got lots more valuable content to help you. Again, I make these videos because I want you to be depression and anxiety free. You absolutely deserve to do that. And I'll be excited to see you in the next one. Take care for now.